Hello, good evening, and welcome. This is Café Scientifique, brought to you by Simon Fraser University. And my name is Cynthia Henson, and thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome. At this time, we're just going to give it a minute or so for more people to come into the attendee room. It's great to see lots of familiar names. Thank you so much for always joining us every month when we do this. And a warm welcome to all those joining us for the first time. Again, for those hopping on this Zoom webinar, this is SFU's Café Scientifique. This is our second session for 2023. Thank you for joining us tonight. And my name is Cynthia Henson from the Faculty of Science at SFU. Thank you for joining us tonight. All right, I guess we better get going. I have 5:02 on my time. Again, this is Simon Fraser University's Café Scientifique, and my name is Cynthia Henson. I work at the Dean of Science office over at Simon Fraser University. And for those joining us for the first time, this is a discussion series where we feature our faculty members to showcase their research interests, and share it with the public. And this is also a chance for all of you, for all of us, to engage with our research faculty to learn more about their research topics. And this is our second session for the year. We hold about 6 or 8 sessions each year, and we're staying virtual for now, also because we also are engaging with our Beyond BC contacts. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. I just wanted to say that after tonight's session, we will be sending out a feedback link after tonight's event. We welcome any suggestions or comments that you might have. Also, because you've registered on our Eventbrite page, your emails have been included in our Café Scientifique mailing list. So you should be receiving more updates on the next discussion series and events. And we're happy to see lots of our Café Scientifique regulars. Thank you so much for joining us each time. And a warm hello and welcome to all of those joining us for the very first time. Thank you for always being with us. Let us begin by acknowledging that we are privileged to gather today on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Coquitlam, and Musqueam peoples. We thank them for having cared for these lands and waters since time out of mind, and we look forward to working with them in partnership as we continue to build this great city together. If you know whose territory you're currently on, please take a moment to reflect on this. And if you don't know whose land you're on, I encourage you to look it up and make yourself familiar with the indigenous peoples whose land you occupy. I'll head up and read a few house rules for tonight's event. There is a Q&A box made available on your end. Unfortunately, the chat page is turned off, but please use the Q&A box to type in any comments or questions you have for tonight's presenter, and we'll try to read out everyone's questions after the presentation. There's also a live transcript that you can turn on if you find that convenient and helpful. Please go ahead and turn that on. And just a reminder that this event is being recorded, and we will be sharing the link on our website and on our faculty YouTube channel. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our presenter for tonight, and you see her name on the slide. She's a faculty member of our Department of Molecular Biology and Biochemistry, and she's here to talk about watermelon red snow. Watermelon red snow is a telltale sign of springtime blooms of microscopic algae on alpine and Arctic snow. Under the microscope, the algae are stunningly beautiful, but still, why do we study them? Tonight, Dr. Lynne Quarmby will take us on a journey from molecular biology to the high Arctic and home again, illuminating the science of cells, of climate, of snow algae, while offering a reminder that much about the human experience is beyond reason. In tonight's talk, we will hear about one scientist's search for what it means to live a good life at a time of increasing desperation about the future. If you can please help me welcome Dr. Lynne Quarmby. I'd like to invite you to share your screen now, Lynne.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everyone who is here today. I will share, and we've somehow didn't get to the beginning. There we are. Okay. So thanks everybody for taking the time out of your days to be here, and I am indeed going to take you on a journey. So this is me standing on a sheet of Arctic sea ice in the summer of 2017, so just about 5 years ago. And as you're probably aware, in the Arctic, because of global warming, we are losing the sea ice. So every year in the summer, the sea ice shrinks and it gets thinner. And then in the winter, it gets thicker and spreads out. And we have this rhythm, but with climate change, every year it thaws a little more and grows a little less. And so we are predicted to have ice-free summers in the Arctic. Maybe, we don't really know. It's a very difficult thing to predict, but it could be as early as 10 years from now. An ice-free Arctic summer. Because this is such a specific, measurable, easy to get your head around consequence of climate change, it is symbolic. We think of the Arctic sea ice, and that is something that everyone can relate to. We think polar bears. We think of global warming in this context. So as someone who's been thinking and studying and learning about global warming for a long time, this was pretty amazing to be standing on this sheet of ice that is definitely hard and real and blue, but also is filled with all this metaphorical meaning. So I want to talk about how I got there, how I got from my lab at SFU to be standing on this ice. So here is looking down a little bit on the sea ice, and you can see, just like a glacier, most of the ice is under the water. And this is looking, I think, pretty much straight up to the North Pole. But we're about 500 kilometers from the North Pole here. And here's our ship. I was traveling on an artist residency on a tall ship. So we spent 2 weeks exploring around Svalbard, and we spent 24 hours tethered to this sheet of ice and just drifting with the drift. So now we'll wind back many years, and I'll bring you back to the Arctic in a few minutes. This is a single-celled algae that I spent 2 decades studying the molecular biology of. It's called Chlamydomonas reinhardti. It lives in wet soils, in ponds. It swims. It has many wonderful features. And the reason that I study it, and lots of other people study it, one of the reasons is that these cilia are highly conserved evolutionarily. So even though Chlamydomonas is over here and humans are over here, and the last common ancestor between them was the last common ancestor of the eukaryotes, so very, 2 billion years between us evolutionarily, and yet these structures, these cilia, they're made of the same proteins, they're made in the same way, and they beat in the same way as these mammalian cilia. So the ones on the top are respiratory epithelia, the cells that keep our respiratory tract clear, move the mucus along, take the dust out. And the ones on the bottom are from ependymal cells in the CNS. So in our brain, moving the cerebral spinal fluid. And you can see they're the same kind of cilia, same structure, same protein, same function. And okay. So because of this evolutionary history, we can do experiments on our algae and do genetics and all kinds of experiments that you cannot do on mammals, or that take a lot longer. You can do some of them on mice, but not all of them. And through these experiments, we are able to discover genes that are involved in the synthesis of cilia, the maintenance of cilia, the functioning of cilia. And we can take what we learn and see what that can teach us about cilia in mammalian cells. So this is a cross section of a kidney in a mouse embryo. And we can see that in the developing kidney, there are different kinds of tubules. And I just want to get you to focus on the lumen of the tubules. Some of them are red and some of them are red plus yellow, a little bit of orange in them. And that's because we've stained here with several markers. The blue is marking the nucleus of the various cells. So these are the cells around these tubules. And we've stained for cilia. I'm going to see if I can get through, if the slide will go. There we go. So in each case, you can see these tubules are lined with cilia. And in this case, they're very short cilia that we think are involved in sensing the chemistry of the fluids in the tubules. So they all have it. But if you compare the different ones, some of them have my protein that I discovered in Chlamydomonas, and some do not. And it turns out through collaborations with human geneticists, we were able to discover that when our protein is mutated in such a way that it doesn't get transported to the cilia, it can cause cystic kidney disease, a polycystic kidney disease. And our gene in particular causes a very severe form of polycystic kidney disease called nephronophthisis that affects children. And we were in collaboration with with the human geneticists, we were able to show that a small group of children had different mutations in this gene that was the cause of their disease. So the work was fascinating. I felt like I was doing valuable work. I felt like I was good at it. I felt like we were making progress, and that what we were learning was fascinating, just understanding how cells work and how the cilia works. I absolutely loved this work. However, while I was doing it, off in my peripheral vision, starting at around 2005 is when it hit home for me. I read George Bombayo's book Heat, and I saw Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, both in that year. And I had been vaguely aware of climate change, but in that year, I really started to become anxious about it. I started to feel, gee, you know, I've been hearing about this for a long time, but our governments don't seem to be taking the action they needed to take. You know, we dealt with ozone, we dealt with acid rain. Why aren't we dealing with climate change? So I started to get more engaged, and you know, I would go to protests and sign on to letters and things like that. Oh, I didn't really explain that graph, but it's a circular plot. You can see the months of the year around the outside, and this is temperature anomalies. So global temperature anomalies starting with 0, and the 0 in this case is based on a baseline of the average between 1850 and 1900. And so once around the circle, it's comparing January to January, year over year. And then are we above or below that baseline? And so obviously we're going above, above, above. And here we are at 2020, bumping up into 1.5. So it's bad enough, the warming, you say, well, a degree and a half, how bad can that really be? That's, it doesn't seem like much. And in some ways it's not. It is a lot of energy to be adding to the globe. But where it really is impactful is that it is not, the increase in temperature is not evenly distributed around the Earth. So these data are from NASA, and I'm just going to run their video here. This is a higher baseline. Now, the reason they've chosen a higher baseline for the average temperature is the temperature is already warmed. By 1950 to 1980, it's warmed a little bit. And that means that we can have a wider scale in our heat map. So we can see the years where it actually cools versus the years where it warms, and we just have more range in what we can see. So here, when we get blue, it means it's cooler than the average of 1950 to 1980. And when we get yellow, it's a little warmer. And when we get red, it's a lot warmer. So let's just run this through. This is rolling 5-year averages. And we can see it bouncing around. I hope you can see on the top. Oh, here we go. There's the years, 1920s, 30s, 40s. And we can see some places are blue, some are yellow, not too bad into the 70s. Oh, it's heating up here in the 80s and the 90s. Uh-oh. And this is from 2 years ago. So as you're probably aware, the Arctic is heating much faster than other places on average. Some places are cooling. The sad part is that this little spot of cooling just off Greenland is freshwater runoff from the melting ice cap and causing a lens, so we're not getting as much ocean mixing. So there's lots of things like that. There's lots of air currents impacting things and water currents impacting things, but the big take home is that the Arctic is warming a lot faster. And because of that, and not just because of that, this is the simplest way to think about this is one simple example, the jet stream that we're basically familiar with is driven by the temperature differential between the Arctic and the temperate just below. So when we have a big temperature differential, there's a lot of energy to drive the jet stream, and the jet stream flows around and is very important in controlling our climate. So the oscillations in the jet stream will determine to a large extent how long a particular weather system will sit over top of us and when things move along. And one of the things that's happening with climate change, with the Arctic warming faster, that temperature differential is much less. And with a smaller temperature differential, less energy, the jet stream is now getting very lazy. And this is why we have these Arctic influxes of Arctic air that come very far south, and they're very slow and they sit there for a long time. And we have droughts that sit there for a long time. We have lots of things slowing down with the jet stream. And now that's the general concept, but you think of all the big rivers of air, all the streams I'm distracted because I'm freezing my image. I hope it's okay for you guys. Cynthia, let me know if there's a problem.
Yeah, you're okay now.
Okay. So it was I just wanted to go through that as to give you a feel of the concepts, because we also have changes that are happening in ocean currents, and ocean currents that are losing some of the momentum, some are gaining momentum, and those are very important in determining climatic patterns. So this is what we mean, we talk about global warming, and that is the greenhouse gases holding in the heat that is coming from the sun. So these gases, we won't go into the chemistry, the gases holds the heat in, and that heat is then translated into these different patterns of warming because of the currents, and then these currents are changing, and that's how we get global warming causing climate change, which in some places can be prolonged cool periods, as we've experienced ourselves. Okay, so these greenhouse gases, there are several of them that are very important. Carbon dioxide is a key one for us to talk about as one of the important byproducts of burning fossil fuels. This is the famous Keeling curve. These are monthly averages taken in Hawaii. And you can see the annual oscillations. So in the spring, it starts to come down, comes down over the summer a little bit. And that's because of photosynthesis, all the algae in the sea and all the deciduous trees with their full leaf, they're taking carbon dioxide out of the air, pulling it down. And then in the fall and winter, we have decay, we have bacteria eating those leaves, we have less photosynthesis, and CO2 levels come up. That would be the natural cycle would be down here, but this trend line is due to fossil fuel emissions. And at this point, it's just absolutely no question about that. The data is very solid. So this was happening in my head. I was thinking about climate change, and I got hit really hard by images similar to these. So these are from the Copenhagen 2009 climate conference. And this was in the news. I was aware of it. I saw images, but they didn't impact me that much. I mean, it just was one of many things happening. But in 2012, I happened to be in Copenhagen to give a scientific talk. And my host took me out on a walking tour of the city. And we came upon an exhibit of street art, big posters of photographs. And they were photographs like these from the protests. And something in me changed. I stood there and I saw this art exhibit, street art, and I could see the facial expressions on both sides and see the intensity. And it just, something went, wait a minute. Why such opposition? Why is there this enormous power against protesting for something that is so obviously essential and important and for the good of all? It was the first time it really hit me in the gut what we're up against and why our governments weren't acting. It took a while to process and figure out, but I finally understood the enormous sums of money behind fossil fuel interests and the extent to which they have infiltrated all aspects of society, captured much of our political systems, and have controlled the message for a very, very long time. And in fact, that controlled message is something that is a huge barrier to change. So starting after that experience in 2012, well, I came home and it wasn't long before I got arrested. So this was a couple months later. It was my first act of civil disobedience. We blocked a coal train in White Rock to draw attention to the fact that the Port Authority in Vancouver was in the process of approving expanded coal exports at a time when we need to be phasing out fossil fuels, not building whole new ports of export. And then on the top right, this is SFU poet Stephen Collis and I sitting out in the woods on Burnaby Mountain in the early days of the Burnaby Mountain protests against the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the Trans Mountain expansion, as it's now called, the TMX. And we were on the site and talking about what can we do? How can we get more protesters out here? We can't allow this expanded pipeline to go right past our campus without speaking up, without drawing attention to this. So Steve was getting things written and out there, and I had an op-ed that was published in the Vancouver Observer at the time. And together we started bringing lots of people to the mountain, not just us, other people were very busy, various groups, in bringing people to the mountain to protest. And then in 2014, just I think October 30th, roughly 2014, I was in my office at Simon Fraser, and at that time I was chair of the department, so I was in the departmental office. and I was served a stack of papers 4 inches. And it turns out I started getting texts and emails and phone calls. 5 of us received these papers. We were being sued for $5.6 million by Kinder Morgan for obstructing their ability to do their work. We were getting in their way, tortious interference. So we ended up in court for 4 days. They won the injunction to keep us off the mountain. And that meant that there was a police tape line that we weren't allowed to cross. And then I had to make the decision with this $5.6 million, or my share of it, hanging over me, what to do. And it seemed like no better time to get arrested and to draw attention to the issue. And in fact, this time I was much more together in how to think about these things, and had a speech ready and met with the media and gave a speech about civil disobedience that went national. It was in the national news playing this video, and Elizabeth May saw it. And the next day I received a phone call from Elizabeth May, would you run for the Green Party? And at that point, it seemed the natural thing to do. I was really operating very much from a place of fear and panic, and feeling the need to do everything I possibly could do to change the course of our path with respect to fossil fuels. And so this turned out, this is 2015 national campaign. It turned out to be a very long one, 10 months. And the first many months I was doing my job at SFU and trying to run the campaign. And I was absolutely exhausted. And then the last 6 weeks, I was able to go on leave and focus 100% on the campaign. I gave it everything I had, and I came away with 5.6% of the vote. So it was a pretty intense few years. And as you might imagine, I pretty much collapsed at the end of that. I had to make a decision. My major grant that funded that wonderful research that I started off telling you about, that grant had been due for renewal within a couple of weeks of the election, and I had to make a choice. I couldn't do both. So I did not renew my grant. So when this was over, I had no funding to do my research. I didn't know what I was going to do next. So I started exploring, opening my mind, trying to think, what does a 50-something do at this point, when I've just kind of exploded what was a really wonderful career path. And that's when I met Watermelon Snow. I went to San Diego and to attend the cell biology conference that December. I didn't have any research to present, and it was the first time. I've been attending the meeting for 25 years. It was the first time I went feeling quite free. I don't have anything to worry about with respect to presenting. I just want to go to the talks that seem fascinating to me and interesting, and just go driven by curiosity, and then go out to dinners with my friends and say goodbye, because I thought, this is it. I'm leaving cell biology. I'm done. I gave up my career. One of the talks I went to, I learned some really cool stuff, and I met with the speaker afterwards, and we're chatting, and he asked what I did, and I kind of told him my story, and he told me about this watermelon snow, that these are algae, and he says these algae are quite closely related to your algae that you have worked on all these years. So I was encouraged to look into it a little bit more, and the first few papers that I encountered all came from algae that were collected in this area of Svalbard. And coincidentally, I knew about this artist residency because I have kind of dabbled in various aspects of the arts over the years, and definitely have an interest in the arts. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun? Because it's a residency that is open to educators, scientists, architects, They want to bring people to the north to discuss, as they put it, the big issues of the day, and to interact, get different people interacting. The reality is it's almost all artists, and it's very competitive artist retreat, but it's not so competitive as a scientist. There are not great facilities on board this ship for doing any kind of science other than collecting samples. So I applied and was accepted and went to the Arctic to collect samples of watermelon snow to see if I could study this potentially climate-related algae. So here we are setting out from Longyearbyen, heading north along the coast of the west coast of Svalbard. And I just want to remind you that I'm arriving here on this ship. What I think is my problem is that I'm burned out and that I'm depressed and I just don't have much energy. And I was pretty frustrated with myself because here I am on a once in a lifetime trip, and I'm having a hard time really engaging. But what I am doing a really good job of is standing at the railing, being in complete awe. Everything is disconnected. Obviously, no Wi-Fi, no connection with the outside world. And we're here, it's summertime in the Arctic. We have 24 hours of daylight. The sun dips a little, but it's just always gray anyway. So you can't really tell it, you know, 3 in the afternoon, 3 in the morning, it all looks the same. And you look at something like this, you have no idea how far away is that? How big is it? So space and time and distance and everything. Well, even the fact that I'm on a ship with a bunch of artists, when I'm used to going to scientific conferences, I felt like a fish out of water in that context, socially, as well as this physical environment. So it was a real jolt, but it was also, I was having some fabulous conversations and filled with awe at the different ways of looking at the world and the concern that the artists were bringing to the table. So the trip, I don't want to give too much away. It was absolutely transformative in many ways, but more than that, I would say that it was healing. And there were things like, this is a bearded seal sitting in the middle of this photograph on this piece of ice. And at one point in the trip, one of the artists had a hydrophone in the water, a microphone that can go deep into the ocean. She had it on a wire hanging over the ship and captured the sounds of the seals singing to each other. And she was playing it in real time on the deck of the ship. And it's like 3 in the morning, we're all out on the deck of the ship, just hearing this amazing songs going back and forth under the water. There were so many experiences that were so awe-inspiring on this trip. And while I was there thinking, well, I'm busy, I'm healing, and I'm healing from my burnout, I thought. But what I gradually came to realize is that it was more than burnout. It was unprocessed grief. And it was the grief I was feeling around climate change and around all the impacts, personal and global. So I came back from the trip, and by this time I had discovered that there are watermelon snow patches in the mountains all around Vancouver, lots of it. I didn't really have to go to the Arctic for that reason. But it turns out it was a really important trip for other reasons. And I processed those reasons in writing this book. And what I came to understand is that I had not processed this grief, and that the time in the Arctic was so important in terms of inspiring awe, and that awe opens you to appreciate things outside yourself. It takes you outside yourself. And that was a key step for me to begin processing the grief. Not that I have succeeded or finished or anything, but just to recognize it and to make make a good start on it. So back home, we start sampling in the mountains, doing all sorts of fun collecting, and discover that although my colleague in San Diego had said, oh yeah, they're real closely related to your guy, we quickly discovered that there's actually dozens of species, and none of them is particularly closely related to my guy. But it's okay, because we are having so much fun studying them and learning about them and characterizing them and learning how they survive and what else is in the snow. And it turns out there's all sorts of critters in the snow that are eating the snow algae. So here we've got pictures of rotifers with snow algae in their guts. Some of you will know of the water bear, the tardigrades, and he's caught red-handed. Eating snow algae. His gut is stuffed with snow algae. All sorts of creatures are living there with the snow. And this is looking at much closer, so we can see bacteria, all sorts of fungi, different kinds of fungi, different kinds of algae. Just this very rich little ecosystem, microscopic ecosystem, known as a microbiome, right there on the top of the snow. So it's been fascinating to study it. And we're studying not only at the microscopic level, but this is a satellite image. And you can see just in this is an untouched, straight off the photo deck satellite image. And you can see the watermelon snow in the mountains. And one of my graduate students has done a deep dive into image analysis and working with several different satellites. And we are preparing a manuscript now. We've put together a global map of where the snow algae occurs and looking at changes in those patterns over the last 20 years, digging into the historic satellite data. So we're looking really small and really big and really getting inside this issue of the snow algae. So I'm back home, the book's published, working back into the routine. But of course, climate change, that nothing has really changed. The weight is there. And I'm constantly grateful to the people that are out on the front lines protesting. I know how hard it is. And I support as I can, but I have not been able to get back out there. And I also support everybody who's politically engaged, and I have come to really deeply understand how our political system is in serious jeopardy, and to the deep extent to which it has been captured by the fossil fuel interests. And through all of that, I have come to a place of feeling that there are deep psychological issues that where we need to start to really address issue of climate change, to really get people to be open enough to consider the options and to see more clearly, because we are now, COVID really, really illuminated how divisive things are and how locked in our camps we are and how closed down, and that this need to open up and to have more curiosity and more of an inquiry-based approach. It seems really fundamental, and I don't know where this is going to go. And certainly we need everybody doing everything. We need people, whatever it is people are doing, we need them doing that with climate change in mind. I'm not saying everybody should do this. What I am saying is this is where I am, is I want to explore the ways that I can encourage people to experience more awe in their lives and to open to that. So I have a triptych coming up in an art show. It's a group show on the theme of climate change, and my triptych is on the theme of awe. And who knows where these things go? We all just do what we can. Okay, so that was a little bit of a journey with a scientist, with little bits of science along the way. Oh, just one final note on science is that what I have discovered recently is that there is actually a science of awe. So when I say these things about science opening us up and science making us less self-centered and more focused on pro-social perspectives. There's actual psychological research that supports those things. It's been happening for the last decade. And anyway, all right. Thank you all very much for listening. And I wanted to leave lots of time for questions. And I think that we've succeeded at that. So I encourage your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thanks.
And we do have a few questions come in. And I'd like to invite the rest of the audience to please keep typing those questions. Use the Q&A box. You have access to that. And I will try to read as many questions as time will allow. But I'll start off with the first one that I see. Lynn, is the loss of summer sea ice in the Arctic being mirrored in the Antarctic to the same rate, if not to the same degree? I think he was referring to that global heat map.
Yes,
that you
yes.
had shown.
Okay, fantastic question. It's the same but different. So in the Arctic, we're looking at atmospheric temperatures in the NASA data that I showed you. That was atmospheric temperatures. In the Arctic, we're talking about sea ice that is it's floating on the ocean. In the Antarctic, for the most part, we're talking about an ice cap that's sitting on land. And some of those glaciers are undercut by the ocean, so they're flowing into the ocean. And the ocean currents are warm enough that they're melting those glaciers from below, and they're basically accelerating the rate of slide of those glaciers into the ocean. So we're losing ice in both cases, but in the Antarctic, the really significant thing is that when that ice falls into the ocean, it's adding water to the ocean. It has a very big effect on sea level rise. In the Arctic, when the sea ice melts, it has no effect whatsoever on sea level rise. So, and the temperature differences that we're seeing, it's partly because we're talking land in one case and ocean in another. So there's so many ways to answer this question. Dan, I hope that is a start at least to answering it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And while we're speaking of the heat map, there's another question that's sort of related, because you were talking about temperature increases that are not uniform in all areas of the globe, and the Arctic warming is a bit faster. How does this affect agriculture and food supply?
Oh boy, in so many ways. So let's see where to start with that. Okay, one is if you think about things like the jet stream slowing down. So in California, we've recently had an extended drought, a 10-year drought, with big impacts on the ability to, well, big impacts on the water supply. And now the major reservoirs in California are at risk. So they could get through the drought because they had the reservoirs, we're losing the reservoirs. So water is going to be a huge issue. Agriculture, as a lot of it is done right now, we use fertilizers that the potassium fertilizers in particular are very fossil fuel. Well, all of them are fossil fuel intensive to make those fertilizers the way we're doing farming, as opposed to regenerative farming where we recycle things, where we compost things and maintain our soils. We're depleting soils. Droughts lead to soil erosion, so we're losing soil. And then the opposite side, we have floods. We have unseasonable and prolonged flooding that it impacts crops. We have, in addition to too much water, too little water, we have too much heat. So sometimes the thermotolerance of the plants is not there. There are many factors that are impacting agriculture, and it's not as simple as everything just slowly moving north. It's not like that at all. It's much more complex, and we're already seeing huge increases in food prices, and that is going to continue for sure.
Right, right. Well, follow up to that, because it relates to food, will it also affect our drinking water supplies or anything like that?
Yes, it will. And so many places it's affecting water supplies in different ways. A place like Vancouver, our water supply we get a lot of water in our reservoirs from rain, but over the course of the summer, as the snowpack melts, that snowpack feeds the reservoir and keeps the reservoir full enough that we make it through the summer. Well, getting less snow or having the snow melt faster and sooner means that the snowpack will be gone, the mountains will be bare earlier in the season, and there won't be that snowpack to keep the reservoirs up. So that is an impact that will be happening in the Vancouver area, but it's happening mountains. I can't remember the numbers, but a very large fraction of the human population actually obtains their water from mountain sources.
Thank you. Next question. Is there someone in the audience who's currently reading Alex Epstein's Fossil Future? It has really challenged my support for radical conversion to renewable energy sources. Can you comment on his salient arguments?
I haven't read that book. Maybe Dan can type in an argument that has concerned. I certainly am familiar with a lot of arguments on both sides. So chances are I'm familiar with the argument, but I haven't read this book, so I don't know exactly what that refers to. Fair enough.
I like the next question. How did it feel like living up north?
It was great. I loved it in many, many ways. It's another world up there, and I would have loved to stay longer. In fact, 3, I think, of the people that were on the ship have returned. It's a big journey, but they have gone back. Yeah.
Nice. Next question. Algae are red. Are they related to the algae that cause red tides?
Well, yes and no. So all of these unicellular algae are related if you go back far enough, but they're not at all closely related. And the red pigments, the things that make them red is serving a very different function in the 2 organisms. So they're not toxic like the red tide organisms are.
Good to know. And also with algae, how do the algae colonize the fresh snow every season?
That's interesting. Well, so as I mentioned, there's lots of different species, and we don't know very much about any of them really, but we've recently discovered in my lab that one of these species of, the red guys with the walls, and they don't look like they have any way to move. And was thought for a long time that perhaps they get blown in on the wind, and when the conditions are just right, they start dividing and make a bloom. And some of that probably is happening, but for at least this one species that we've been studying, when it's in low light, it loses the red pigment, it loses the thick wall, and it grows a pair of cilia just like the Chlamydomonas. So it actually looks like our Chlamydomonas, which is the ancestral condition of all those algae. And so we're postulating that maybe these guys are on the substrate under the snow, and when the snow starts to melt, they get a signal to hatch out of whatever their overwintering spores are, hatch out and swim up towards the light. And then once they're in this really bright light, then they produce the red pigment, lose their cilia, and photosynthesize. That's our model. We don't know yet. We're working on it. But we do know, what we do know is that they form both life forms. Like, so both the bright red, thick-walled guys and the guys that can swim are the very same species. So
wow, that's incredible. Next comment and question. Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Quarmby. You touched on it during your talk, but given your research and the scope and scale of climate change, how do you ground your perspective to avoid feeling too small relative to the issue?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Kyle. It's it's really an important question because, you know, there were times when I was really involved in my activism and running for political office when I just felt I have to do everything I can, and you know, maybe I'll be that extra little thing that makes the difference, and we can do all this. And now I feel smaller than that, in the sense that I just see how big and how deep this problem is. And there are times when that feeling can make you feel helpless and what's the point? And I'm just going to go, you know, fly to Hawaii or something, because why should I care? Because I can't do anything. And if I go or don't go, it doesn't make any difference. So that kind of feeling feels really lousy. You can't really let go of it and forget about it. It's there. It's going to come to Hawaii with you, and you're going to feel lousy because you flew when you didn't really need to fly or whatever. And so I know that. And what I know is that sometimes the feeling small can be translated into, yeah, maybe I'm nothing at all, but holy cow, man, I'm alive. And I get to look at these images from the James Webb Telescope, and I get to think about this amazing stuff that's happening. And I get, you know, and you can become small in a way where political arguments start to seem like, you know, whatever. But you're not engaging with politics. You're not engaging with this, but you're engaging with what's really important. Why are these arguments being made? And why, how can I learn to recognize misinformation from the fossil fuel interests? How can I figure this out? How can I spread awe in my world around me? How can I encourage people to notice these things? So yeah, I can relate to Kyle and his question, but.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Next comment and question again. I feel many people believe but are somewhat paralyzed about action, the what can I do sort of question. Some could give money, etc. But can you envision some sort of set of action plans to help people out of their paralysis, their feeling of panic and grief, like how you felt and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely something that I can relate to. So one thing I think that helps with that question is to kind of think in terms of systems. So if you recognize that everything's connected to everything, and there's so many, whether you're, you know, a school teacher or a bus driver or a clerk in a retail store, or whatever your thing is, and whatever hobbies you have, and whatever lifestyle you live, that's where you start with your climate action. And so the first thing, the most important thing for us all to do is talk about it, because it's amazing. You know, I have so many times been in situations where I thought, oh man, nobody here even cares about the climate. And then you start talking and you realize actually everybody in the room cares a lot about it, but they turn that off because they don't know what to do. And as soon as you start talking about it, then you can start to recognize things that you can do and things you can do together, and political engagement, or starting up, you know, I live in a place where there's a local group that started buying heat pumps, and they've organized this thing where they service, they install and service, so they can get heat pumps into people's homes for a third the price that it costs to buy them retail and to hire somebody. So it's this community-based thing, community gardens, you know. But the big thing, I think, is to do the things that you like doing. And so, you know, I'm painting right now, and I'm saying, well, I get to give an artist talk, I get to write an artist statement, I get to talk to people who don't usually talk to scientists, who have studied climate change, and I get to talk to them about climate change. So, you know, you can make almost whatever you do about it, about climate change, but talk to people, I think, is number one.
Yes, that sounds very inspiring. And this next question is somewhat related to what you were just explaining just now. You were talking earlier about being in a ship, collecting samples of watermelon snow, and being among several artists and less scientists of your kind. How did this help you, given that you were feeling depressed, frustrated, exhausted, and feeling like, as you say, a fish out of water, and feeling very disconnected? How did this help you in healing from an unprocessed grief?
Well, one of the things was in talking to the artists on the ship, I learned that they're very curious about climate change, but many of them didn't have the knowledge. So they had a good sense of what was happening, but we had many good conversations. So it helped me feel that I knew something useful. And so we had many conversations that were very enlightening for both sides. The questions that they asked and the information I was able to share, but also their projects, the way they're thinking about it, the way they're approaching it. And so on the science front, I was ahead of them, but where they were ahead of me was on the grief front. They already understood that it was grief. And, you know, obviously I'm homogenizing a group of very different people, but there were many people, many of the artists who really understood what grief was and understood the need to grieve and understood the grief related to the climate and why that was important. And that was something that I hadn't thought about.
Mm-hmm. Well, that sounds very magical, actually, because it's something that you had not expected, I guess.
Yeah.
And it just, you know, evolved naturally. Next question. Let's talk about the book that you wrote. And you were saying earlier, it allowed you to process that grief and learning more about that microscopic ecosystem that actually exists in the snow. Did this sort of reawaken your scientific self and relieve you of all the climate change anxiety and grief that you were previously having?
So, boy, that's a question with many dimensions. I would say none of this has really relieved my climate anxiety. I'm getting much better at living with it and learning to live with the aspects that are unknown, and recognizing that however bad the data might look, we don't know the future, and that there's lots of historical examples of things changing really quickly. Once they start to change, they can snowball really fast. So it might seem impossible to get off fossil fuels, and then, you know, a few years later, we're off. It just, these things can happen really fast. So I remind myself constantly that I don't know the future. And in not knowing the future, there's comfort. And as I was writing the book, I did a lot of reading and I read many grief memoirs. And so I just kind of, I don't know that I can put it in words, but I got a deeper understanding of what it means to grieve.
Nicely put. It took me a second to digest what you just said. The last thing you said, I love what you just said. There's a follow-up question here. Appreciate your time and story. And he wants to ask, in a broad sense, what are you excited and hopeful about with regards to changes that are happening?
Well, you know, there are many changes. There are changes happening in communities all around the globe and big transitions that are happening and developments in technology that's happening. But this afternoon, when I was going through, every time I give a talk, I go to the Keeling Curve website at UCSD. They have the curve and I get the latest one. So the curve I showed you today was updated February 21st, 2023, the latest readings of the concentration of carbon dioxide right there. And I just showed you guys one graph, but I'm always checking, you know, how it looks on different scales. The other thing that I look at, the one I showed you was from 1958 till today. But while I was there this afternoon, I was also looking at other ones. And one of the ones I like to check in on is the 2-year graph. So you see much more detailed data, and you see the 2 cycles. And then you can compare from going in to going out, you know, over a 2-year period, and you're the same February 20th, 21st, 2 years ago, and compared to today, and you can see those 2 data points. Every time I have given a talk on the book or on, I've been giving talks on climate change, different kinds of talks on climate change for over a decade, but the Keeling curve is a staple. It's something that I've always come back to. And over that time, it's always kind of hit me in the gut that here's 2 years later and we're up here. Today was the first time that I noticed that slope. We hear all sorts of things about we're burning less fossil fuel or this or that, but it's kind of like being on a diet and saying, you know, I didn't eat this, or here's what I ate, and forgetting, oh yeah, I did have that big piece of chocolate cake when I was at my friend's house, but I didn't have my notebook and I forgot to write it down. That kind of thing is happening all the time in the accounting of fossil fuel stuff. So I never trust those things too much. But this is like getting on the scale and seeing what I weigh. Am I telling the truth about my exercise and my diet or what? And so looking at the Keeling curve is like getting on the scale, and it looks like we are really slowing down. It's not, we have to turn that corner, but it really looks like we're starting to turn the corner. So for me, because I go to the fundamentals, Kyle, that's the thing that gives me hope. But also, in my community, lots of people are doing so much, and so many more people. You hear climate change, it's everywhere you turn now. There's podcasts, it's in the news. There's no hesitation to attribute, an atmospheric river or whatever is happening, or the heat domes that we've experienced. It's so present that the denial is gone and it's everywhere. So that's a really important step.
That's very inspiring.
Yeah.
Next question here is, you mentioned you've delivered lots and lots of talks on climate change. How would you explain climate change to very young kids in the simplest, most digestible manner? Imagine a 7-year-old asking you what climate change is and what can he do?
So humans discovered fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are basically big chains of carbon. And when we burn them, burning means that you add oxygen out of the air. That's why fires need oxygen. And that breaks down those chains, and the carbon dioxide goes into the air. Now, we love to burn fossil fuels because we can capture that energy, and that means we have lots of extra energy to help us do our work. And because of that, think of how hard it would be if we had to, carry all the concrete up the hill to SFU to build it, if we just had to, but, we have fossil fuels in our trucks and we can drive all this stuff up there. And that means we have time to, go to rock concerts or, whatever fun things we want to do. We have the time and we have all the extra resources. So we like to burn fossil fuels. But what we now know is that those carbon dioxide molecules, the carbon from the chains and the oxygen, when those go in the atmosphere, what happens is energy from the sun comes in, it hits the earth, plants photosynthesize, all sorts of good things happen. And a good amount of it bounces back out, especially stuff that when the light lands on snow and ice, almost all of it bounces out. When it lands on dark water, some of it's absorbed, and eventually it will be re-emitted. So for a very long time, for 10,000 years, the earth was in energy balance. So light would come out, energy would radiate out. We had fairly constant climate. but when we started burning fossil fuels and adding the carbon dioxide will capture some of that energy on its way out. So it comes in, it's on its way out, it hits a molecule of carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide starts vibrating more and hits other carbon dioxides, increases the temperature, holds the energy in. Eventually it goes out, but it holds it longer. And it holds that heat in, so we have more energy in the atmosphere, and it warms and it provides energy for storms. Our storms are getting stronger and all those other things. So it's warming and it's causing climate change. So I'm not sure who asked that question, but I don't know if how old your child is.
I'm guessing it was I hope whoever asked that question, I'm not sure how old this person is, but I hope that's something that you were able to understand at least for today. I'll end with the last two questions I see. You mentioned earlier that climate change discussions have very deep social psychological issues. Can you expound a bit more on this, please?
Oh, golly. Yes, I can certainly say lots more about it. It's a bit of a moving target because those issues have changed. So when I started doing this work, there was much more climate denialism. It's not really happening. The scientists aren't looking at the whole picture. They're misrepresenting their data. You can't trust, there was a lot of people that wanted to deny, but what a lot of people didn't realize, and this has now been exposed, so this is public knowledge and there's been papers written about it, fossil fuel interests were actually feeding that denial, even when they knew that climate change was real and it was really happening. They were feeding the misinformation that really supported these denial. We don't hear much denial anymore because the world has changed. There's so much, it's just so overwhelming that the denialist arguments don't work. So now what is happening is deflection. It's the individual responsibility. It's because you eat meat, you fly, you do this and that. And hey, we're just giving you the energy you ask for. You got to change your life and then it'll all be better, which I'm sorry is not the way it works, because we are living in a society where it has been, our society has been structured around fossil fuels. People are working all the time, trying to make ends meet, trying to get through the day. They have to do the thing that they can afford and the thing that's easiest. And our society is built that those will be fossil fuel based things. So we need to change policies and regulations and the way we fund things to change the structure of society. And the messages for deflection coming from fossil fuel interests are trying to prevent that because they want to keep the fossil fuel interests going. So, and I could keep going on that, but maybe that's enough on that theme.
Well, thank you for that. I'll end with this one, and probably this might be a good way to end tonight's discussion. You mentioned science of awe and allowing that to help us focus more on the social perspectives of climate change. Can you expound a bit more on this, and what is the science of awe?
Yeah, so there's a new book out that is for a popular audience. So actually, Café Scientifique attendees might be interested in this. The author's name is Dr. Keltner. He's at UC Berkeley, and he has published a book. The main title of it is Awe. It's just out this month. And the subtitle is something about the science of wonder in our everyday lives. And the book is written for a popular audience, and it really covers the science, the psychology research. So it's social science. It's not the kind of science that we're doing in our Faculty of Science, but it's science of lots of questionnaires and lots of assessing people's self-perception, pro-social, pro-self, and relating those, for example, to how much awe people are feeling, what makes them feel awe. Huge data sets, global data sets. And it was pretty fascinating because my intuitions, that book just came out and I was not aware of a lot of the research. So I didn't know about it when I wrote this, wherever, I don't know where the focal plane is here, when I wrote this. But my intuitions here were that this awe that I was experiencing in the Arctic were healing, and they were changing my way of looking at the world. And that was all in this book that I just read by Decker Keltner. So yeah, the science of awe.
Well, thank you very much. So with that, we end tonight's session. I'd like to thank you, Lynne, so much for sharing your story with all of us. It's such an inspiring way of listening to you actually tonight. Really enjoyed that. And I'd like to thank everyone who've joined us tonight with this discussion. Thank you for those questions that came in. And we hope to see you for the next one. Next one's happening on March 28th, and it's on quantum technologies. And we have someone from our physics department do that presentation in March. And you will be receiving more information on that next session through your emails because you've been part of our mailing list. Again, thank you so much, Lynne, for presenting for us tonight.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for attending.
And thank you, everyone. I hope to see you in March for the next Café Scientifique. Until then, have a great rest of your evening. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.